Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Finding Me, a Memoir. Finding Me, a Memoir by Viola Davis is a book that I first saw maybe a year or so ago. I added it to my book list to read, because I'm someone who's interested in the entertainment industry, though not necessarily into celebrities, but I like the creative arts, and I find it interesting to read books about people who are actors and actresses, musicians, to learn about their creative process, what their lives have been like, and through their stories, gaining some understanding of how various facets of the entertainment industry work. I like Viola Davis as an actress. I first became aware of her in the movie Doubt, and then I watched maybe like the first season or two of How to Get Away with Murder. And in the years since, she's been in a few other movies that I've checked out, right? I think she's a really great actress. I've also seen her give acceptance speeches at award shows, participate in interviews, PR events, things like that. And I've found that she's a great actress on camera, but she's also equally interesting off camera, right? I don't really follow celebrities, but I do find people in general interesting, right? Like, I'm not into fame and things like that, but I think you can learn from other people's experiences, and it can be beneficial to help you grow as a person to hear about other people's life experiences and their perspectives on things. Not to say that you'll necessarily change your views and opinions to match theirs, but as a human being, there's only but so much that you personally get an opportunity to experience. And sometimes people who've had different experiences from you, whether that's in the course of them, growing up or even now as adults, understanding their reasoning, the things that they've been through, how they view, perceive, and experience the world, it can give you a different perspective on life, on the world, on society, and not necessarily cause you to change your own views and opinions, but rather kind of stress test your own views and opinions. And along the way, you can maybe get different perspectives, but it might also offer an opportunity to fine-tune your own views and beliefs. I think that as people, we all benefit, right? We should all continue learning and growing as people. Rather than, I'm just going to completely shut myself off to considering perspectives, I think you should remain open to learning and growing as a person. And as part of that, I find that I like to read about people. I make it a point with the accompanying Black History profiles to really not cover athletes or musicians unless there's something more to them, right? Their story beyond them just being entertainers. Right. The reason being that I feel within the Black community, there's so much emphasis, or rather, so many of our icons are athletes and entertainers. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think it gives some career limitations. It can create some limitations as far as what we as Black people, and Black children in particular, view as being possible for us as a community. Like, I believe we're fully capable of achieving success, and there are other ways to be successful. There are other ways to achieve financial stability beyond being a singer, rapper, athlete, actress, or whatever. There's nothing wrong with any of those careers, but rather there's a variety of other careers out there that we can also pursue. But it feels like quite often Black people, Black children especially, in hopes of achieving some degree of financial success and stability, that quite often Black children are pushed towards these particular industries. You don't see as many prominent examples of, let's say, doctors and lawyers, teachers, social workers, people in those kinds of professions, nurses, physical therapists, respiratory therapists, marketing executives, all of these other career paths that are promoted as being available for children from other communities, but not necessarily for Black children. And so I try to balance that out with like the profiles that I make, with entertainers, where they need to have something special to them beyond just being talented, be it that they express some kind of business acumen, they overcame some kind of obstacle, they were the first to win some kind of an award. The thing can't just be that, they sing, they're a cool rapper or something like that. There needs to be a bit more depth than that. But it differs a bit with regards to the books and movies that I cover. The reason being that with books and movies, regardless of whatever walk of life you come from, people in general are interesting. And there's much to be learned from most people's lives. It's just that typically, your rank and file everyday people, they generally don't really have the time to write a book. And quite often most people don't wouldn't really read it unless there's some really amazing event in their life story. But I feel like with books in particular, there's a greater chance of picking up something or finding something to take away from reading someone's life story. There's the saying that you can learn from other people's mistakes, right? Or you can learn from mistakes, but generally speaking, you won't live long enough to make all of them. And that the smart thing to do is to learn from the mistakes of others, and through that, the trials and tribulations of other people. And I think that's certainly the case here with Viola Davis's book. From interviews that I've seen, I know that she mentioned growing up in absolute poverty in Rhode Island, but I didn't really know the full gist of her backstory. I just knew that she'd grown up poor and then got into acting, and that it took a long time for her to become, let's say, mainstream successful, or at least to appear that way. So going into the book, I wasn't concerned that it would end up being some shallow book about being famous, because I've seen interviews with her before, and that's not really the sense that I get from her. But I was still very pleasantly surprised by the book. I've seen interviews with her. She's very well spoken, very articulate. When I say articulate, I mean expressive, able to not just convey her thoughts and ideas through words, but to really dig down deep and clarify her thoughts, feelings, emotions about very complex issues. With regards to, in particular, I've seen interviews with her discussing the intersection of difficulty brought about due to her being a Black woman in entertainment. In reading the book, I was thoroughly impressed, in part because of her vulnerability, her willingness to be very honest and open about her experiences, some of which are absolutely terrible and harrowing. For most people, their inclination might be to hide these things, but instead she uses the book as an opportunity to lay everything bare. And maybe to some degree, it's cathartic in a way, where maybe she finds some release in expressing these things, share these experiences that she's had. So basically, Viola Davis was born in South Carolina on a plantation where her parents, or at least her mother, had grown up, and her grandparents still lived. At the point that she was born, her parents and grandparents were sharecroppers. She was born in a cabin, her grandparents' cabin on this plantation, where her mother had also grown up. Her mother became pregnant at the age of 15 with one of her older siblings and was married pretty soon after. So by the time Viola Davis was born, her mom gave birth to her when she was in her 20s or something like that. And her mom had 5 children, her 3 older sisters and an older brother. And then several years after Viola was born, I think maybe she was 12, 13 years old, her mother then gave birth to another child, which was her final daughter and Viola Davis's youngest sister. But Davis was born during the winter on this plantation in South Carolina. Her family didn't have a lot of money, limited opportunities, and her parents, when she was quite young, decided to move up to Rhode Island. Her father worked as a horse groomsman, keeping them clean, taking care of them, racehorses and whatnot. And so he moved from the South in search of better opportunities, and moved more or less with his wife and all but the 2 oldest children who were left behind with the grandparents. Davis was a baby, but I can't remember if she was a few months old or whatever it was, but she was quite young when the family moved to Rhode Island. And what came about was that, her father found work as a horse groomer in Rhode Island, and her mom worked on occasion as well, but primarily stayed home to take care of the kids because there was quite a number of them and they were still quite young. There just wasn't a lot of money in the house. In the house, her dad was the primary breadwinner, but the role that he was playing, the job that he had, really wasn't paying enough for a man to support himself, his wife, and their 5 or 6 children comfortably. And this was a result of him having grown up in the Jim Crow South, right? Because if Davis was born in the 60s, her dad would have probably been born in the 30s or something like that. And it's explained that her dad, they estimated that he had a 5th grade education. He states that he dropped out of school in the 5th grade. But growing up in the Jim Crow South, the lack of quality education for Black children at the time, Davis states that looking at his penmanship and some other factors, that he more likely had what was the equivalent to a lower grade level education, more like a 2nd or 3rd grade education. To drop out of school at the age of 10 like, what do you really know at that age? Then add to the fact that for Black children in the South, the education that you would have been receiving would have been subpar. So it means that if he dropped out at like the age of 10, where you still have quite a bit to learn, but the education you're receiving is actually below that of your average 10-year-old, you're even further behind the ball. There's so much that you don't know. And as part of this, like her dad didn't really learn to read until a friend taught him when he was 15. And combine that with like the gaps in his education and thus the gap in his literacy capabilities, not just his penmanship, but math, reading, and all of these other areas as well. Your prospects for employment would be very limited. And he had this family, but because of the limited education he received in his youth, it then meant that he had limited options for how he could provide for them. And as a result of that, Viola and her siblings grew up in poverty. Davis didn't have a full understanding of the details of her father's childhood. It seemed like she might have learned a little bit more as she got older, but whatever it was that went on in his childhood, I think it's mentioned that he was raised in part by a stepfather, and there was some physical abuse in his home, where it sounds like he was probably severely beaten, which seemed to have been not necessarily a common practice. Because physically disciplining children, I think, was far more accepted as the norm, or at least as an option in the past. And so with that, he grew up in a rather dysfunctional household. And as an adult man, certainly not excusing it, some of those frustrations came out in the manner in which he dealt with his wife and then also dealt with his children. Where it's like throughout the book, Davis details her parents just having these horrific fights, violent fights, where, and it's like in addition to all these other things, her dad was also an alcoholic. Likely using alcohol as a means to in part numb the pain of his childhood, deal with his frustrations as an adult, and lacking healthy coping mechanisms and outlets, resorted to violence and lashing out. One of the key targets or the focus of his frustration was his wife. And so Davis shares multiple instances of her father, like just beating the hell out of her mother. None of that would make the situation better, and not just like hitting her with his hands as in slapping or punching her, which would be bad enough, but like, throwing glass and other objects at her, hitting her with a piece of wood, just like random objects. Striking or hitting your romantic partner is bad enough, but in this instance, picking up objects and striking them with it with the intent of causing serious bodily harm, beating her to the point of, at times where she'd end up in the hospital with like broken bones and like serious wounds and injuries. There's multiple instances where Davis describes, her and her siblings would awake in the middle of the night to her father beating her mother, coming home from school and seeing like a trail of blood, pools of blood as a result of their father beating their mother. And combine that with them growing up in poverty, where the homes they lived in weren't really fit for people. They wouldn't have money to pay the water bill. And so there wouldn't be running water, or there'd be no heat in the place where they were living. And I think at one point they lived for a stretch in an apartment that was pretty much condemned. But being unable to afford living anywhere else, that's where they lived. And so as a result of that, they didn't have water, they didn't have heat with which to heat water. And so it's like you're using cold water. At times, you might be having financial issues where, the heat isn't working, or they don't have money to pay the bills or whatever. There's repairs to be made. They might not have running water, let alone hot water. And so it's like you'd be trying to take a bath with cold water, or you might not have any water with which to take a bath. And as a result of that, Davis shares the trauma of being a poor child growing up and all that comes with that, right? With being unable to properly bathe and wash yourself, but still having to go to school where with other students and teachers not necessarily understanding their circumstances at home, or maybe knowing their circumstances, but not being sympathetic to it. I guess you could say it's like a natural reaction where kids are coming to school, their clothes are unclean, her and her siblings are having to wash their clothes by hand. There's no heat in the house, so the clothes aren't drying. They're coming to school with the clothes damp. They can't really take a proper bath, so their hygiene is poor. And as a result, they come into school, they're unkempt, they don't smell very good. Students and even teachers would recoil from them, right? Would to a degree reject them. And it's actually really sad in a sense. It reminded me of some of the details from Mike Tyson's childhood. Things that people experience as children can affect them into adulthood. For children growing up in poverty, we can kind of overlook some of these details about how you might be socially ostracized because of being poor, being unable to properly wash yourself, the impact that can have on a child's self-esteem. And so it's like, that was like a tough part of the book to read. The stress of living within this household where it's bad enough that you're poor, you don't have food, you're going to bed hungry sometimes, but then there's like this additional thing of a basic thing like not being able to clean yourself. Then add to that the dysfunction of your parents' relationship. And the kids as a result get caught up in that, right? Even if it's just bearing witness to it. The kids grow up where pretty much all of them are ongoing bedwetters, where it's typically something that stops when kids are like toddlers, maybe even preschool. But here it is that you have these kids, because of the stress and whatnot in their lives, they're wet in the bed until into like late elementary school, and in some cases junior high. Growing up in this house, which is like infested with like rats as well, terrified me because I don't like rats. They at one point was living in a specific house where it's like the rats were living like they were paying rent. They were in like the closets. They'd be in between the clothes. You have to make sure that you use the bathroom before you went to sleep, because to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, the bathroom would just be overrun with rats. Specific about it, not mice, but rats. You're laying in bed and like rats are running over you. Like one day her mom was taking a nap. This rat is on the pillow next to the mom. Like I would have a heart attack. That part of the book, it was a lot to get through. You don't want to wallow in dysfunction, but I think at the same time, we as society, we need to provide greater support for like the most vulnerable members of society. And with that would be children, the elderly, those who have health issues, and not just like disabilities, but things that render them unable to function within society like your average person. And I feel like when you read stories like this, it's like for regular kids, it's difficult enough progressing through childhood into early adulthood when you have a good support system. But add in the reality of deep poverty. No one should be living like this in a country like America. It should just be absolutely unacceptable. But it's like the more I read books of this nature, not that you're going to use anyone else's misfortune for your entertainment, but I think it makes plain that there are so many social issues within America that need to be addressed. The portion of the book about her childhood is heartbreaking because, like most people, I have a soft spot for kids. But at the same time, there was a bit of a saving grace where, sure, she had some negative experiences in school. And, add to that, not just being poor, but also race. This could just be my ignorance, but I don't really imagine a lot of Black people living in Rhode Island. I don't think I've ever met a Black person from Rhode Island. I don't think I've really met anyone from Rhode Island. But in reading about things like, being chased home by groups of boys who are yelling the N-word at her, absolutely unbelievable. As a kid, I think I kind of took it for granted growing up in New York, and specifically growing up in Brooklyn. The part of Brooklyn where I grew up was heavily Black, a mixture of Black, Hispanic. My family was from the Caribbean. You had like Black Americans, but in a community that also had like a very heavy Caribbean presence. And I never really experienced this kind of social ostracism, or for lack of a better term, the racism that other people experience. There's colorism and things like that. But even today, as a kid growing up, maybe I was ignorant and oblivious to it. But honestly, I didn't really experience any of that. But in reading about the experiences of Black children who grew up as like minorities, it's eye-opening for me because it's outside of what I experienced. Not to dispute anyone's experience, the hardships they face, being like the only black kid or one of the only black kids in their school or the neighborhood. It's just that it wasn't my experience. And so when I read books or watch movies where people explain having grown up in some circumstances, it's always eye-opening to me. And so reading here about being chased home by like the neighborhood boys because she was black was just like insane to me. I don't think you can read this book and not be affected by the things that she went through. But what I found most amazing was that growing up, she then found this outlet of acting. She explains that as a kid, there was like this talent show that she entered with her siblings and the joy that she felt participating in that show and then becoming involved with some of these other creative and like theater workshops and programs where it became an outlet for her to kind of get out these feelings that she'd been carrying around with her and how it really changed her life. And so it's like going back and thinking about it, it once again reminds me of Mike Tyson, where he had this really rough childhood, as Viola Davis does here. But they found these outlets that allowed them to vent some of these negative experiences, some of this frustration that they were feeling. The difference between the two of them is that Mike Tyson's was based on his physical abilities, which was boxing. Viola Davis's was based on her creative abilities, which was acting. And with that, it took them down drastically different paths. But I think it's absolutely amazing for both of them, as in that it took Mike Tyson some time to get there. There were some bumps and bruises along the way, but that ultimately he was able to escape poverty. And while he messed up and whatnot, he eventually got his life on track, especially with the help of therapy. But at the same time, it kind of gives me pause because they grew up in neighborhoods where they weren't the only poor kids. They weren't the only kids that were struggling. And even looking beyond their specific communities, they weren't the only ones dealing with these types of issues. Where you have these stories of kids struggling with poverty or dysfunction in their childhood, and then it's like they find some kind of outlet that helps them to escape. For kids like Mike Tyson, it might be sports. For others like Viola Davis, it might be some creative talent or ability where they can sing, they can act, something, or they can paint or something like that. And then you have those who are like academically gifted. They're able to escape poverty through academic performance. They go on to attend good schools, colleges, and whatnot, enter into a profession that allows them to provide a more stable life for themselves. But then a lot of times, the way that comes about is there's typically an adult or some other person in their life that sees them, recognizes their need and their talent, and takes it upon themselves to do something about it. Now, that can take different forms where it might be a coach, it might be a mentor, but basically there's an adult that takes the time, they see this kid struggling, they see some ability within them, and they help to set them on the right path. And that's incredible. But I always ask myself the question of, what about the kids that never meet this person? The kids that are struggling, but they never meet that mentor. Or even in the case of Mike Tyson, I always felt that in reading his book, it was terrible that he had to go through those things in his childhood, and he found boxing in prison. Why were these programs and opportunities not being provided on the outside? Why did it take him going to jail to find boxing? In Viola Davis's case, she came to the attention of a teacher by pretty much acting out in school. For the most part, her teachers weren't really aware of or trying to understand why it was that she was acting out in school, or why she wasn't coming to school, or coming into school unkempt, smelling of urine and whatnot. And it's like she passed through so many grades, came into contact with so many teachers, and it was much the same with Mike Tyson, where Viola Davis expresses what largely saved her, what allowed her to escape from poverty was her sisters. Not her parents, but her sisters. Having these 4, 5 other sisters, most of them being older, like her eldest sister in particular encouraged her, and they each found their own little outlet. They had various degrees of success and, escaping poverty in adulthood, but her oldest sister began to encourage her from a very young age. Her sister was like 9 or something like that, and I think Davis was like 5 when she moved north to live with them. But from that early age, she explains that her sister arrived at their apartment, saw like the squalor of the place and told Viola Davis, like, you're pretty much going to have to do well in life and figure something out so you can escape from poverty, because you don't want to grow up and have this be your life too. And I actually found that to be incredibly amazing for a 9-year-old to come into this environment, recognize its dysfunction, and decide at that early age that this was not going to be her life. And not only to decide that it wasn't going to be her life, but to also speak that into her sister as well, that this life here is not acceptable for you to live. You're going to have to do something to get yourself together, because this life here, I prefer to live a different life. I don't want this for myself, and you don't want it for you either. And with that little bit of encouragement, that was likely I think it was the first person, because she was just like 5 at this point, but just the words of her sister telling her that there's more out there in the world. And this, how we're living right now, doesn't have to be forever. It gave her that initial spark to aspire to want more, that it's possible to have more in life. And I thought that was just amazing. From there, the book then goes on to explore Viola Davis's, like, the rest of her academic career, her going off to college, getting into acting, the struggles that she experienced with acting and trying to build this career. And it's like, I don't want to go too into details on the specifics of what occurred in her life, I think you should read that stuff for yourself. But really, this overarching theme of overcoming is what I took from the book. That's what I found most inspirational, because I think, like, the precise details might vary, but in reading or listening to interviews from many other Black female actresses, and actors as well, a lot of the experiences that she had in trying to establish her career as a working actress, on a basic level, you hear from other people as well. But I thought her personal experience, the personal journey that she went on, that was more interesting to me. That's not to dismiss any of her professional career, but just to say that I felt I took more away from her personal journey, from her story. I found that more inspirational. It's a tough read because there's a lot of stuff going on here. And fair warning, there is some discussion of, domestic violence, sexual abuse, sexual assault, and things of that nature. So if it's a trigger for you, if it's something you might not be able to deal with, there's parts of the book that you'll need to skip over. But all in all, I felt like this was just an absolutely incredible read. And with that, I highly recommend it. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.